Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this very last CIVICA seminar for 2024. Before we start, I'd like to start with a bit of housekeeping. So this seminar is recorded, and the recording will be put on YouTube after the talk. And we'll start with a bit of an introduction of, today's speaker. And the seminar will last for about 45 minutes, or the talk will last for about 45 minutes, after which I'll open the floor for questions for about 15 minutes. And for those of you who haven't joined us for this series before, the CIVICA seminars is a collaboration between the CIVICA network of universities, so about 8 universities, among them Hertie, Bocconi, Sciences Po, DUI, and your host today, LSE. And these seminars are about tackling complex societal challenges through the use of new methodological and data-driven approaches that draw from machine learning and quantitative methods from biology, sociology, political sciences, economics, and physics, among other disciplines. Today's speaker, who I have the pleasure of introducing, is Florian Guitton from Imperial College. He is a software engineer and researcher who has a background and experience in advanced computing. He has a master's in engineering in software engineering from Epitech in France, as well as an MSc in advanced computing with a specialization in neurobiology-inspired computational intelligence from the University of Kent. His work mainly focuses on applying computing technologies to healthcare and biomedical research. And his research interests have evolved to focusing on confidential computing. This year, he has introduced the concept of honest computing, which he's going to be talking to us about today. So, Florian, the floor is yours now.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Steph, for your introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you all here today. I won't waste time. I hope to be informative, if nothing else, for the next 40 to 45 minutes. And I think I'll just jump right in. So today I'm going to be presenting to you the context and the content of a paper that we've recently published with colleagues called Honest Computing. Also, how to achieve demonstrable data lineage and provenance for driving data in process-sensitive policies. Today, the goal is not necessarily to go very deep into technological implementations or technical details, but rather to have an overview and understand how we get to honest computing as an applied technological framework to help create new types of policies that are more aware of what is technically feasible and also a lot more kind to the use of data that we see today, which is ever prominent and certainly is not going to stop anytime soon. I want to give you a bit of background about where this work comes from. So I've joined the Imperial College of London about 15 years ago now. And my topic of research, as I mentioned earlier, have been very much focused on healthcare and specifically following clinical trials and the implementation of data systems for clinical trials. That in 2015 evolved sadly because we started to think about policies and policy frameworks very differently around it. And this is because 2015 was the sort of turning point where policies like GDPR, regulation framework like GDPR, started to come into consideration and then into effect. So we needed to start thinking very critically about how the data is handled within clinical trials, and specifically look at how we handle privacy and the limitation of use for data within this context. You can imagine that in clinical trials, we collect a lot of information, certainly a lot of personal information, and more it is fashionable to look at clinical studies in the context of unbiased studies, meaning we don't really know why we collect the data. There is no particular defined purpose for each piece of data. We simply collect as much as possible, and then eventually data analysis down the line allows us to gather a lot more insights, but we can't predict where those insights are in advance. And so in that context, we published a first research paper on the implication of GDPR and the limitation of GDPR. This led us to understand the trade-off that the various people drafting that framework have made in terms of the consideration of data and its ownership. In fact, you'll be able to see that in GDPR, there is no such thing as ownership of data. You will have subjects, data subjects, you'll have processors, you will have controllers. And so the notion of ownership is something that was amiss. There were multiple reasons for that, but a lot of them were technical and simply having to do with the inability of the technology at the time to structure a framework that could be validatable in the context of GDPR. And so then it started us, myself and my colleague, on a journey to start understanding technically what is feasible, how we can start addressing these policy challenges. And now we are almost 10 years down the line, and we have started to crystallize a feasible technological solution to address these more tedious policy challenges. So perhaps on my next slide, I want to go over the landscape. So there are two different kinds of policy that we can typically derive in implementation. Some are principle-based and some are rule-based. It's important to know the difference because things like GDPR are principle-based. In fact, if you go through the definition of the framework, you'll be able to see that there are multiple principles through which data has to be considered for its use and its collection and its management, etc. These things essentially do not define any validatable rules through which data has to be managed or through which your processes have to be managed, but rather general guidelines as to how you ought to care about the data, you ought to minimize its collection, you ought to control its dissemination. And that's by opposition to rule-based policies, which effectively define very, very precise ways of validating that a process is happening correctly. This is, for example, a question of you must report that data X passed the threshold of Y within 3 days. And so this is very much rule. This is something that we can validate and demonstrate. And so obviously, when we start looking at this and seeing the various types of scandals in terms of data management that would have occurred over the past many years, we can start seeing how principle-based frameworks, while useful to guide processes in the right direction, still, because they're not enforceable and not validatable, leads to a vast amount of oversight and problems. Here I've named only about a few. For example, in 2014, you had the Barclays dark pool scandal. Then eventually in 2021, the NHS DeepMind scandal, where the NHS started to share data with private companies, which eventually in the end ended up using this for other purpose than the one that were defined. You have other problems as well when it comes to the data fabrication. You will all be aware of the story around Professor Francesca Gino and the data fabrication. A lot of that really had to do with how the data was manipulated, how it was processed, how it was created. And obviously there is only some good principles and no rules per se. And most recently this year, it was earlier this year in February, there was a big scandal with the utilization within the context of the TfL ULA system, data collection system, of the contemplation of driving license information from a European citizen well outside of the purview the control of car ownership and fee management. So this is kind of the background that we are looking at here. A bit further, I want to point out something in particular, which is about the technology velocity, the pacing problem. Very often we see that technology outpaces much faster the progress of regulatory framework. But in this particular case, when we talk about the validation and the enforcement of processes when it comes to data movement, policy, and manipulation, there is a gap where, to some degree, technologically speaking, we did not have the tools when these regulations were put in place. And so this is one of the rare scenarios where we have this unusual technology versus policy velocity sort of reversal that comes in. And this is starting to sink into the mind of policymakers, and some of the problems around that are starting to also show up within the new upcoming regulatory frameworks that we start seeing. For example, we have the DORA policy, which is coming up, applicable or at least considerable from January 2025 onward, which starts to make very specific wording available to us in terms of what entities ought to be doing and how they ought to implement the safety of data. For example, one thing that it starts saying is that data must be protected, including during its processing. And it's something that wasn't necessarily the case before. You will all have heard that my data is encrypted when it's at rest, or the data is encrypted when it's transferred somewhere else, or between different parties. But the question of the data being encrypted or at least secured during the processing is something that sort of is never talked about because it's never really been feasible, right? And we'll go over a bit more of that in the coming slide, but I invite you to kind of consider this and the shift that it is from a regulatory perspective to start including that exact wording within the frameworks of regulation. To go a little bit into the title of the paper in relation to these problems that hopefully now you grasp, I want to point two specific notions. One is the data provenance, and this is really about the authenticity of a piece of data. Where is it being generated? How is it being generated? And in opposition to the data lineage. The data lineage is much more about what has become of that data. How is it being processed? How is it being treated? What is being derived from it? What other piece of data gets derived from that? And those are two separate notions. Today, we typically will see a lot of data provenance aspect. We will sort of know where the data comes from, and it will have a very well-defined origination. But even then, and this is, for example, the case with Professor Francesca Gino, provenance was simply not something available, or in fact, it was falsified. And so this is one of the problems that we need to tackle. And then separately, the data lineage. You'll all be familiar with typical data manipulation processes where you take a piece of data, you copy, you paste it into an Excel spreadsheet, that gets copied and pasted somewhere else into some analytical R pipeline, and then somewhere else. The traceability of what has happened to the data is something that is completely lost as part of these processes. And that's also fully part of the lacks that we have. And this is what obviously enables these companies from deriving usage of data that wasn't planned for, or conveniently forgetting that some processing has happened because there are no traces of it, or effectively bypassing entirely the data collection process and the traceability around that. So those are two important topics. It is not necessarily the first time that we think about the safety of data per se and its origination and its authenticity. And there's been a lot of work done in the world of digital evidences, typically for electronic data and information. where we start looking at cryptographic techniques to validate the authenticity of something, certification, signatures, cryptographic signatures. And so there is a lot of work being done around this. I invite you to consult the legal requirements, for example, for a piece of digital evidence to be admissible in court in the context of a court case, or how it can be effectively used for police investigation, for example. And another thing that's a little bit outside of the background per se, but it's definitely in scope, is that while thinking about how we start addressing these problems technologically, we have been looking specifically at a particular type of technology landscape. And there is a scale that exists. It's called the technological readiness scale. It has multiple levels from 1 to 9, and they define essentially levels of maturity of technologies. In the context of that particular piece of research, and for making sure that what we were talking about was achievable today, we've only selected technologies that were at the very least at the level 5, which define technologies that have been successfully tested outside of a laboratory environment or outside of a research environment in real world conditions. Which means that while the honest computing systems don't necessarily exist as such today, they are fully realizable with the technology choices that we have made. I would like also at the same time to bring an element of semantic and definition to this. Here, I want particularly to draw your attention to the difference between security, secure, and honesty, honest. In the context of my talk here, we are talking about honest computing and what it is for a system to be honest in the way that it handles data, that it processes the data, and honest in the way that it can be audited to have done so. And this is in opposition, or rather in contrast, with security, which would be, for example, having to do with the encryption of the data, or the redundancy of the data. How many copies have you done? Can you make sure that it has no alteration? And those are concepts you will find in frameworks like GDPR when we say that data must be protected against accidental damage or loss. It must also be kept from being accessed unduly by some other people. But all of that really crystallizes the aspect of security, but doesn't necessarily address the aspect of of honesty. So we'll go a little bit more into that, but hopefully it is enough for you to, at a high level, to understand what we mean by the difference between the data being safe and secure versus a system being honest and demonstrably so in terms of how it processes the data and what data. And another thing I want to talk about in this context is the problem with trust. We have been thinking about data management and data manipulation for a very long time now in consideration of trust. Do we trust the system to do the task it's meant to be doing correctly? The issue when we let ourselves simply be driven by trust is that trust is a simple belief. It's not real. It is something that you have convinced yourself you have towards a system, a person, an institution. And there are various roots of trust that can be established. You can establish a root of trust at the level of an organization. Do you trust the government? Do you not? At the level of an institution or a company, do you trust the company manages your data in the way they say they will? Do you trust they don't collect your data when you navigate their website? It could be the trust at an individual level. Do you trust that the person working for that company has done their work correctly? Do you trust that they were not tired that day, or that they were not drunk that day? Or you could imagine any other option. And then you can continue going down that level. Do you trust that a computing system is safe and secure? Well, yes, perhaps it is, but it's got an administrator, and the administrator has access privilege. And so while you trust the system, again, you fall back onto that trust of the person, and you end up with these chicken and egg questions where you start balancing your trust from one level to the other. At the end of the day, we argue in our work that trust is definitely a root cause of the issue that we have with drafting policy, and it is a cause as well as a symptom to using principle-based policies. It's all trust driven. So with that, I want to start telling you about the high-level concept that we think are important to start addressing these problems in the context of creating our framework of honest computing. There are a few things that we have to consider for a system to be honest. The first one, it has to provide deterministic execution. So what does that mean? It means a system that will have a predictable output for predictable input. It will always provide the same output given the same input, and will consistently do so, right? And so obviously this is where you start having questions about randomness processes. We have lots of algorithms, for example, that will use random values to provide noise or things like this. So we have to start thinking about systems that provide a randomness, but a randomness that is deterministic. And that allows us in turn to ensure the reproducibility of this. In an academic concept, for example, you would expect that after a study, and particularly in a clinical study setting, that the same data run through the algorithm will produce the same result, and so that study results are reproducible to some degree. Well, so this is essentially the same thing, but pushed all the way to the actual systems that are performing these computations. Another thing that a system will need to display, to be honest, is transparency. We will need to make sure that the system is able to operate in a way that we understand what it does. And here there are two different branches of transparency that we can think about. And this is because in some system, we would be looking at proprietary algorithms, for example, commercially sensitive algorithms, for example, places where you'd have to protect your IP, as opposition to software and systems where the code, for example, would be open source. And so then we have to think about what does it mean for something open source to be transparent. I think that's quite self-explanatory. But also separately, what does it mean for something to be transparent in the context of a proprietary system? And there are many different ways of achieving this to provide accountability for stakeholders. That is not to say that some of that would require trust. For example, in the context where you would have a proprietary software, you would imagine a system where somebody will verify that the software is written in a way that it does what it says it does. And then there is an element of trust that you start having to add back into that environment. But from an academic perspective, we can think of transparency as an open source layer. So you know exactly what the code to run is, and therefore make sure that this code run as it's intended to, in a deterministic fashion, to echo back to what I was saying earlier. So once you have something that is deterministic and transparent, it's all good, but can you verify that this is the case, right? So how can we make sure that the system has verifiability? It means a system that can provide the ability for us to check that a calculation or a process happened exactly in the way that it was intended, based on the transparency we expect, and that it does so in the same fashion every time, based on the determinism that we expect. And here, this is where we start having to think about concept of correctness checks and validation of these processes. We'll go into a little more detail on that on the next slide, but I invite you to consider verifiability. Can I check that my system is doing what it says it does? This is, by the way, one of the bigger problems when we start talking about policy, right? Because having a self-reporting system where nobody is able to validate what you say you have done is essentially a source of the problem, source of the trouble. And finally, the system needs to have integrity, meaning that any of these three things that we've talked so far cannot actually be altered. It needs to ensure that there is tamper-proofness, both tamper-proofness in terms of the data, and again, this goes in line with the requirements of policy frameworks, but also in terms of the software that it runs. Can you make sure that you can protect the software execution and the code from ever being modified? Or if it is modified, that you then have a way to go back up the chain of verifiability, transparency, and determinism. And in terms of so this, to finish on the slide, this is essentially the four big characteristics of what we expect an honest system to do its job, right? And this is where we would have typically gaps in the existing frameworks. Say you rent out some space on the Amazon cloud and you do some computation on it. Your algorithm doesn't rely on random noise, and you have the open source code. Well, that's great. It's deterministic and it's transparent. Maybe you'll have data checks that allow you to make sure that the data is safe and you've copied it multiple times so you know that you got the correct data. But you now have the validity problem, the verifiability problem. you can't trust that Amazon has done has executed your code on their server without listening to it, for example, without observing what it is you're doing, without observing the data values as they were processed through the system, for example. And so current approaches will have one of these four pillars as a gap. The good news is, referring to the technological readiness level I mentioned earlier, is there are technologies today that we can start thinking about using to address those four issues all at the same time. And these are technologies that were not available when regulatory frameworks like HIPAA, GDPR, and others were written. So this is only now that we can start seeing some of that changes and some of that included into systems into regulation like DORA. The first one is confidential computing. So confidential computing is a technology that was developed in 2015, 2016, perhaps before that in the labs, but commercially available at least since that time. And essentially it is based on what you'd call a trusted execution environment. There is a definitional problem here, is that other people have decided to use trusted execution environment for describing other systems and typical cloud systems. So this is the sort of thing you would see, for example, at the Genomic England or in some academic institution where their central research service will provide a trusted execution environment. Nothing to do with that. Here, when we talk about trusted execution environment, we're talking about microchips. We're talking about CPUs and hardware. Typically, the hardware would be capable of doing complete calculation. They are not all equal. All TEs are not born equal, and some of them are not capable of that. But for the purpose of honest computing, this is what you would want, because we want to have access to the full breadth of computation that's feasible. These ones, again, in the spirit of not all being born equal, have different features and different categorization level. I invite you to visit the link that will be at the end of the presentation as well, where you can find our paper, where we go in details into how all of these different levels are done. We and also other prior researchers who have been looking at this particular thing. In this context, the four elements that are very important within the realm of trusted execution environment that we need to obtain honest computing is that we must have these TEEs capable of integrity validation, freshness, capable of encryption, and remote attestation. Remote attestation is the particular key component that will allow the system to perform these verifiability measures that we talked about. And here I've precised that it must be done with measurement, but essentially this is the ability of a microchip to be able to change a cryptographic state while it executes code in such a way that you can remotely validate the code that will be executed is the one you want, and after it has executed, that it has executed in the way that you want it. This is, again, in comparison with the security, it's not to say that things were not covered with, but you have the ability to validate that. And all four of these characteristics of TEs must be present for honest computing to function. Another thing is distributed ledger technology. And so this is very much about the tamper-proofness aspect of the problem. Typically, TEs will be a single microchip on a single server. But the problem of trusting a system goes well beyond that. You need to make sure that you're baking some level of redundancy into that system. And distributed ledger technologies are particularly useful for that. I'm sure you'll be familiar with other types of distributed ledgers. If I mention Bitcoin and blockchain, I'm sure all of you will roll your eyes, but that's typically the kind of technology that we're talking about. However, there are great changes, or at least great outlook here, is the use of confidential computing, particularly some of those features we talked about, allow us to do distributed ledgers in a way that doesn't rely on game theory. The aficionado of blockchain technology amongst you will know how the typical either proof of work or staking mechanism work to build trust in a system by distributing it and making it very difficult for single actors to modify the course of these chains, and therefore build the trust by making these problems difficult. You don't need to rely on sort of game theory practices if you have the ability to authenticate computation by a single microchip. And so when you have a TE that is able to provide a cryptographic signature that is burnt into the metal during manufacturing, you can now start thinking about distributing ledger technologies in a way that works for you and that is more computationally efficient. We're talking 10,000 and above times in terms of speed, and green as well. This is a lot more environmentally friendly because the cost of building those chains is essentially the cost of a traditional 200-watt CPU run. And obviously, then you can start building a Byzantine fault tolerance into this so that your system is honest and available at all time. Finally, there is the level of the notion of multi-level consensus, and here we're really talking about cryptographic techniques as well as software design techniques. The best system is only as fallible as the people who are programming it as well, and so it's important to understand that in the context of providing an honest computing framework, we also need to make sure that the software that is built on top of it can behave in an honest way. And at that level, you will have the ability to create distributed cryptography keys to secure data and the encryption amongst that. And that can be done using distributed key generation techniques or Shamir sharding techniques at a cryptographic level for the data safety. And then at the decision tree level, when you build softwares that will rely, for example, on multiple people to approve a particular action on the system before being done, say deleting a value in a particular data set, or maybe sharing a particular piece of data with a third party, and where you require multiple people to approve that action before it is being done, as opposed to a single administrator action type of thing. And so those are considerations that you will want to make sure you have in that technological stack. There are other considerations that you can make around honest computing to complement that these approaches and to make sure that you take in consideration other specific details of implementation that you would have. One thing which I've not talked about before, but is very interesting, is homomorphic encryption. When we talk about encryption in general, we're talking about things that are reversible. So you'd have a private key and a public key. People generate both on each side. They exchange the public keys. They have the ability to create a safety channel, a secure channel, and then they can communicate information with each other. A system that would be in the middle, processing data, will essentially be decrypting all of that data with whichever side it comes from and perform the calculation on top of that decrypted data. Homomorphic encryption starts to change the game because it provides mathematical frameworks to perform data calculation on encrypted data to provide an encrypted result. Today, compared to other options, this is not necessarily something that you would want to select because it has still got a lot of limitations. Many companies working from a silicon perspective all the way to a mathematical perspective is solving the problem of homomorphic encryption. But today it is orders of magnitude slower than traditional computing and doesn't yet perform all the types of calculation you'd expect to be able to perform for data analysis. Differential privacy is an interesting thing when it comes to adding layers of control over how the data is disseminated within honest computing systems by using techniques that allow you to either interfere with the query mechanics or the statistical relevance of the data result in order to hide the true nature of the data or the true data points while providing insights that are equally statistically true compared to the original. You have the ability to start thinking about hardware security modules. We've talked about cryptography in terms of building these layers of safety into the system. The utmost type of safety that you can have is an auto-destruct explosive filled HSM, which you'll find commercially available, and that can be used to start navigating that. It's fashionable, so I'll talk about it as well, but post-quantum cryptography is something that people are considering quite a lot in terms of the safety of their data. And there is no reason why an honest computing system wouldn't want to perform such cryptography as well. Here you'd have to think differently about how implementing your software in the context of an honest computing system to make sure that you use crystal Kyber system instead of traditional elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman system, for example. That you remove older RSA type cryptography with small keys to move it towards something that is more perhaps metrics based. And then finally, another consideration, but I mentioned it in the slide before, and it's also a truly important one, is nothing can be as bad as the poor software development practices that you would come. When we talk about providing privacy for the data and the confidentiality of the computation, management of the data and its safety. If the developer of the system just says that the data can be sent by email by the press of a button, all of these other things we've talked about before just go away. And it would be a shame to implement a system based on this principle that can achieve all of these particular points and have a send all email button at the end to undo it all. And so, you know, this is not necessarily part of the framework per se, or the things that we would want to do, but it is a consideration not to forget. And I just want to brush quickly as a last slide of this tour over what we can achieve with today's technology by mentioning a few of the application field where honest computing already is being looked at in the labs. And for example, there are applications in healthcare where we can start thinking about how the medical records are effectively being manipulated. Who sees them, when they see them, how is it accessed? Can we guarantee that the data is being confidentially processed? For example, that would be a team of researchers that typically would take the data, download it onto their laptop from a central system, run some calculation onto their laptop where they do have access to that data, and they probably will send it to each other by email, and they will probably do all of these things to a place where we design the software to be run within TEs onto a separate infrastructure to guarantee the confidentiality of that data, while also allowing all of these researchers to have the processing mechanics that they need. Finance and banking are obvious culprits on the list, with projects utilizing, for example, honest computing or components of it, like confidential computing, to design things like CBDCs, which are central bank digital currencies, so the legal tender equivalent of the name your crypto money that you would find out there. And this is honest computing is definitely a base that is currently being looked at to design those things. In trading, the ability to perform mutually blind exchange, for example, using validatable transfers and validatable logic is something that is very interesting. If you have any question about this, please feel free to let me know. Supply chain management, where we want to make sure that we can guarantee the traceability and the provenance of the data through the lineage of the transformation that gets done to that piece of data. Notarization, you know, is another important one on that same branch. And then perhaps the last one, which is the most exciting one, because this has been a problem for a very long time and can probably now finally start to be addressed, is the problem of data access revocation. You know that when we start providing a data system and we have these data accesses, eventually somebody gets access to a piece of data. But that somebody might leave the research institute that they're working for, or maybe they're leaving the company that is managing that data for some time. The problem is, obviously, by the time you've provided access, you've provided the ability for somebody to copy that data. Once the data is copied and out of the system, you've essentially, for all intents and purposes, lost total control over it. There is no such thing as data access revocation today. You can pretend it exists if that helps you, but it doesn't. And obviously, if you have internal threat actors, so people with privileged access to data that were authorized to have access to that data, but decide to leak some information, for example, you need ways of protecting against that as well. The ability to have fully validatable, verifiable, and transparent processing while making sure that all of that is encrypted in memory while it is being processed, mean that people with privileged access to systems where honest computing framework run is just not visible. They do not see that data even while it's being processed. And therefore, they do not have the ability to extract it, even if they've had access to it, providing good software practices, as I mentioned earlier. And so, yeah, there are very many topics that we can explore here, but hopefully, I'll thank you now and invite you to look at the paper, which is on archive right now, but soon to be available via the Cambridge Press as well. And I hope that you've extracted something out of that 15-mile high tour of what is achievable when we start thinking about the new technologies available for us in structuring new ways that we can put together our data pipeline while considering the confidentiality, the privacy of the computation and the data, and making sure that we can create new policy frameworks that are more rule-based and validatable and for which we can bring the accountability of people and companies at much desired heights compared to what we have today. And with that, I'm rather proud to say it's exactly 45 on the clock. And so I will yield it back to Rita, and obviously happy to answer any of your questions. Thank you very much all for listening.
Thank you, Florian. Right on the dot. And with that, we open the Q&A session, and there's already a question for you from Funmilola. Thank you for that, Funmilola, by the way. And so the question is, from your presentation, the question of trustability is central to data collection and security. The advent of COVID-19 brought about a lot of distrust in the masses, who accused pharmaceutical companies of manipulating data for profiting purposes. How can the society deal with this issue using legal policy frameworks?
So I think this is kind of where we want to find the bridge between the work that we've done with the description of what honest computing can be, and hopefully influence the direction of research of policymakers. By the time we start to adopt the concepts that I've presented today, which are now technologically feasible, we can start thinking about policies in terms of an enforceable set of rules and technologies to be used. There are many other places, for example, in the banking regulation, where it is mandated to use certain tools and certain metrics in certain ways to provide reporting at the level of institutions, organizations, and government. We could imagine the very same thing happening. If you think about it today, we have, at least in Europe and in the UK, the ICO, the Information Communication Office, where companies have to provide details as to how they manipulate data by the time they reach a certain size, and then inform them whenever some significant security event actually happens. By the time that we modify the policy frameworks to make compulsory the use of systems that would implement honest computing ideas, then we can start having a mathematically demonstrable way of validating that the data they collected was collected in the way that we intended. And when I say we, I mean the general population, right? So we can imagine association fighting for the transparency of data analysis or data collection, or maybe delegated institution that have to look after that. But we can start mandating that these systems be used. And so what this could be is, for example, you would have a mandate to provide a remote attestation signature of the result of computation made on, say, the COVID data set, the COVID data set. There was a project funded by UKRI a few years ago, well, specifically during COVID, actually, looking at new technological mechanics through which we could do decentralized data collection and maintain the privacy of people. As we all know, none of the work done or undergone by the UKRI and its funded projects eventually made it into the decisions that NHS took to contract the Swiss company that eventually built the track and trace app. There has been plenty of academic papers describing the fact that it was not required to collect the postcode of where you were and exactly the name of the businesses you were in to achieve the same results that they had. But obviously, if you start moving the policy toward a direction where you say, please provide us with the digital cryptographic signature of that calculation that we have approved via public vetting, for example, or representative vetting, then we can start building these guarantees and we can start removing that trust out of the equation. Part of your question is also about the pharmaceutical industry, and to that degree, here again, I think that today, as soon as you do clinical trials or anything related to health, even things like GDPR allow you a large amount of leeway. By the time you say this is for the public interest or it's for the vital interest of someone or some authority interest, you can basically ignore everything that GDPR has to say to you about things. Luckily, they don't take it this extremely usually, and they do try to utilize the principles of GDPR to structure their processes. But in the context where we switch from a principle-based regulation to a rule-based regulation, and again, similar to the finance or the banking sector, we start having pressure points where we can enforce behaviors at the level of pharmaceutical companies to process the data in the way that we have agreed, and again, we as a general consensus population for it to be done. But it's not going to be an easy task, and it's certainly going to take very many years for mindsets to change, tools to change as well, in the way that we actually program these tools to exploit these concepts, and obviously for it to be applied. So yeah, I'm afraid I don't have a definite answer as to how we do it tomorrow, but I've certainly got really great hopes that by talking more about these concepts and principles, we can change the mind of policymakers and therefore down the line change the habits of companies and government.
Thank you, Florian. Backtracking maybe a little bit. So you have this very nice theoretical framework here, like honest computing. But back in the real world, how do you see this being implemented, and what challenges do you see happening while implementing this?
Okay, so we have the theoretical framework, and in the pipe right now is also a work of implementation that we've started in our research group as well. So the implementation is achievable. As I said earlier, we've made sure that in our theoretical framework, we've only adopted technologies that were provable to work in outside of a lab. Now, that obviously comes with some challenges. I just hinted at the fact that the software implementation, we have to think about things very differently, whether or not you consider the multi-consensus aspect that I mentioned earlier. But then a lot of the tools that exist today are not immediately translatable to an honest computing framework. One of the key components of that framework is the use of trusted execution environment, those microchips that I mentioned earlier. And those are very low-level primitives. The only way to program them today is essentially to rely on assembly code or very low-level C++ libraries. So very practically, which means that you can't run your Python script in it. And so there is a lot of work, tedious work perhaps, of implementation of micro runtime that can run within these environments. I should add at the same time, these environments are a lot more constrained in terms of how they can perform calculations. So you would not be able to expect very large scale GPU type AI computation on these chips just yet, perhaps down the line, but right now, not just yet. And so there is the most significant challenges right now really gravitate around the need for the process you want to build into those honest computing systems to be rewritten from scratch in consideration of these practical. So that's the most technical aspect of that. And then to look back on the way we look at the problem from a software and a data analytics perspective, we have great gaps. For example, we have gaps in terms of understanding algorithms for performing data quality checks in blind fashion. We are all used to opening an Excel spreadsheet and validating sort of by hand whether or not the age value are between 0 and 100, and therefore it's kind of probably okay in the context of a clinical trial. But automated toolings and algorithms that are able to do wide breadth checks over the quality of data in fully blind fashion is something that we have a lot of gaps. So there is a lot of research that needs to be done for automated algorithms and guided decision making that will need to be that are a big obstacle as well.
Okay. And in the meanwhile, a couple of questions came up. So the first one is, how can honest computing implemented in a hardware-based and decentralized manner on patients' devices address challenges such as inconsistent data formats across devices while ensuring privacy and secure data analysis?
That's a big question. So I think I'll cut this question into two parts. One part hints at the idea that you would have client devices or at least patient connected devices. I think right now the answer to that particular part is, unfortunately, we do not really have any commercially available system that would allow you to have a TEE on a clinical device. I will caveat that by saying that most modern smartphones, like the Android and the Apple of this world, will have a version of a TEE. You'll have the Apple Secure Element, for example. You'll have the Android Key Store chip. And those could be used to create these networks, essentially, of TEEs, including on the cloud side. And I think perhaps you will have seen when was Apple earlier this year started to deploy a framework that they call private cloud compute, which kind of brings about the utilization of these TEs to do that exact sort of thing, mixing them in with the TE present on the iPhone. The things they don't necessarily implement part of that framework is the distributed ledger part and the multi-consensus level part. So that isn't quite there yet commercially or usably speaking, but I think we'll get there rather quickly. The second part of the question was about the data formats. And here, I'm afraid the data format is not simply a question of honesty or a question of hardware per se, of course, but it is a question of software design and best practices. I suppose one of the aspects of the honest computing framework, particularly in the context where we look at it from a lens of distributed ledgers, then it reduces the kind of structure you can create with data, right? So obviously you can compile your data in every way that you want, but because we sort of have this requirement to rethink these systems in the first place, if you rethink these systems in the context of the data formats that are more easily manipulatable within distributed ledgers, then you facilitate the task and perhaps a task of standardization as well. But there is no clear path there. Again, I think this is part of that rule versus principle that is going to be very difficult to go about. GDPR already does that. I mean, GDPR as well as PECR and a few others mandate that data must be extractable in a human readable format in such a way that is understandable. And here again, the key thing is human readable. So even that is a challenge to begin with. It's very difficult to start having to express out on paper a human readable version of your DNA in a way that is also at the same time portable and space efficient in the way that the regulation tells you that you ought to do it. So I'm sorry to disappoint here. I don't have an answer for how that works, but at least the first part, give it a few years, and I think commercial companies will start on the TE side bringing that about, both in healthcare, but also in the financial sector. One big thing I mentioned earlier is the design of CBDCs. A lot of banks are currently looking at using your smart cards, which your bank cards, they have a chip on it. Technically, that chip is not a TE, but it has features that could bring it to be one in a few years. And so there is a lot of work being done there.
Oh, and somebody commented just now that Polypoly developed such a technology for private devices. So thank you for this particular comment. We have two more questions to go before we close. So the first one is, so my question will be from Etienne Boss, who asks, my question will be around the accountability shift towards logic and application deployed on such system. How verifications can be put in place realistically, bearing in mind IP, etc., on these applications without having to trust a third party that will do the verification?
All right. Well, okay. A few parts of that question then. The aspect of verifiability, and I think I hinted at it earlier, truly is made by utilizing mechanics made available by computational computing chips, those TEs, and they really have to do with the remote attestation part of it. So this is where there's a physical mechanism that happens on the metal in the chip that will modify some data registry as data be processed, and then eventually provide a cryptographic signature of that information, give it back to you. I suppose that hints back to the last part of the question, which is about how do we do that for my grandmother? Right, and it is going to be very, very challenging, right? Because obviously not everybody knows how to code, and certainly not everybody knows how to code in a way that is so close to the assembly language that you'd be able to extract out any sense of what's going to happen beforehand. I think this is why I said earlier that while transparency as far as open source code is concerned is a good thing, at the end of the day, whether or not you're relying on proprietary technology source, meaning that instead of the source code itself being used for that validation, you probably validate some form of digest hash, of that algorithm or that code. you will need in that case to have somebody that is mandated to check internally the proprietary code and validate that this is done in a way that was agreed. So that's kind of where you reintroduce a bit of that element of trust. But in the context of something that will be open source, you would probably still rely on, you know, sort of public associations of people who are just happy to give their time to review the code of thousands of companies to see whether or not they behave properly. The key to the question, I suppose, and I will look back on that, is the idea of accountability. The issue today is that both regulatory frameworks and technologies that we have mostly out in the wild do not provide accountability for people who use data, simply because we don't know what they've done with it, when they've done it with it, and what exactly they extracted from it. So there is a very large shift where you start thinking about not only the honest computing system not being able to lie, but by extent, the companies using those are not going to be able to lie. And so perhaps in the future there is, and this is kind of where it gets funny, there'll be a trust metric for people to say that they can only trust the company insofar as they use honest computing systems or systems that answer the same sort of criteria to process their data. I know it's funny because you get back to trust at the end. Very challenging topic. Just as a small caveat on the side, part of that work, we looked at different types of technologies. There is a term out there already that exists that's called trustless computing, right? And trustless computing specifically crystallizes this notion that you can have a computing framework that you can't trust, but that's a good thing. And when we started to play with users and people across multiple projects and things like that with the term trustless and connected terms like zero trust, you realize the breakdown that happens between the scientific view of it, the semantic view of it, and what people truly understand from that. I would invite you to contemplate on the difference between carefree and careless, for example, as a similar way where people don't manage to immediately understand what it means.
And last question related to the previous one. Similarly to the previous question, how would you recommend to project leaders in universities or faculty to apply this on a lower level? Also in relation to safe and honest sharing of data and or models.
Okay, so in terms of the models, I suppose this is a question that comes back quite often because these sorts of technologies can be used to protect intellectual properties when we start doing training models. I will link back, for example, to companies like NVIDIA. NVIDIA technically provides products that can perform computational computing, right? And they do that in some of their hardware, particularly hardwares that they're integrating nowadays into their cars, or at least car manufacturing pipeline. And this is because, you know, the self-driving car data models that they want to execute on the metal in the car, they also want to protect it against inception by other car vendors that would be able to learn things from that as well. So connected to that, I think in the academic sector, models are not necessarily a problem because they're probably open anyway, right? So I wouldn't be worried about this from an academic perspective. On the first part of the question, can you remember remember the phrasing of the first part of the question?
So the question was, how would you recommend to project leaders in universities, faculty
to introduce that? Yeah, I suppose, and this is kind of the experience we're doing as well here as we run these technical implementations and we try to bring it into a project, is to think about it perhaps at first as an incremental process, where instead of providing the honest computing framework on the entirety of the data pipeline and the data processing of it, you perhaps do it first on the input and output of a system. So you start creating tamper-proof logs of everything that gets in and out of the system, because it doesn't require you necessarily to keep track of all the pieces of data, and bring that vision sort of more and more towards the inside of a system. Another thing I would say is start with problems that have manageable size of data. I mentioned earlier that these systems are to some degree still quite limited in terms of the amount of data that they can manipulate. So on the latest of commercially available chips from Intel, for example, and those chips retail for 15 to 16,000 pounds a pop, you are limited to about 250 gigabytes of data at one time being processed. So when we start thinking about things like very large scale AI or very large scale federated machine learning, things like this, you're already well outside of that scope, and so it's probably not the kind of problems you want to start integrating into your routine data pipeline just now. So if I were to look back on that, the first one is making sure that you incrementally do it, perhaps not on the analytics per se first, but mostly on the ins and outs of your data pipeline. And then second, choose a data problem that is limited in terms of its size to actually fit very easily into that sort of thing. And then perhaps finally, it's a bit on the side, but finally, at least right now, it requires people who have a closer understanding to how the machine works and obviously are able to program in languages that are closer to the machine. So unfortunately, at this point in time, all of the Python script writers and all of that probably are not quite yet going to be able to do this, but maybe next year they will. So fourth point, just keep posted with what we do and how other people in that field are also looking at the problem, both in the manufacturing side, but also in the algorithm development side and all of these other things. So there will be some exciting development coming for it.
I'm sure of that, Florian. And on this note, this hopeful note, we're closing the seminar because it's more than time for that. Thank you everyone for your questions. Thank you for joining for this last talk of the year, as I said. And I hope you'll join us for the next CIVICA seminar at the beginning of the year. And on this note, I wish everyone a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year as well. See you next year. And see you, Florian. Thanks.
Indeed. My email is in the paper, and if you need anything, and obviously, Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to you.
Yeah. See you. Goodbye, everyone.